These sessions are meant to be open to all and anyone who's interested in exploring a GVI approach to violence reduction in their community, whether it's community-based organizations, social service providers, law enforcement officers and officials, municipal workers, academics, really any representative interested in exploring the GVI approach and way of thinking to violence reduction in their community. So thank you for joining us. The idea is that these workshops are going to be ongoing. We'll have a bit more about the future of them at the end of the session. But for now, we just want to get a sense of who's in this room and who's here today to learn with us, learn from us, and talk to us. So to that end, I think what we're going to do is break out into a few sessions and just go around and introduce ourselves, say who we are, where we're from, and why we're here, why we're interested in this material, why we're interested in this work, and what we're hoping to get out of these sessions. So I believe one of my colleagues is going to set up the breakout rooms now, and then we'll pop over there for a few minutes, hear from each other, and then come back to get into some of the meat of the material for today. All right, we're welcoming everyone back into the main session now that we've all had a chance to meet and greet a little bit. And I'll pass it over to my colleague Talib, and we'll go from there.
Great, thanks very much, Michael, and thank you all for participating in the breakout rooms. You know, I am an introvert. I hate icebreakers, so hopefully that wasn't too painful for folks. We thought it might be easier to get folks to talk to each other in a smaller setting than to be staring at a bunch of squares on a Zoom. As we were preparing for this particular session, and all of you have just gone around the room and have heard a bit about why each other is here and where you're from, we were thinking about what we wanted to communicate, and we had our stand-up PowerPoint, and we're about to go into it and do what we normally do. And we thought, you know what? Let's try something maybe a little bit different that isn't always done on Zooms like this. So we are going to trust you with our somewhat of experimentation. So, you know, please be sensitive with our feelings, a little bit of grace here. But we thought it would be much more interesting, instead of us showing you a bunch of PowerPoint slides and talking at you, there was a documentary that was done about the original Boston ceasefire, the original Operation Ceasefire that came out of the Boston Project, that really encapsulates the successes and what went well, but also talks about the challenges and what did not go well. And we think that it's probably more and can probably encapsulate some of the key issues and themes than we could. So this documentary we're about to show you, it's about 32 minutes long. It really is like 32 minutes. We'll show the documentary, and then we're going to get into what your thoughts and reflections on the documentary are, and then we'll talk about some specifics about how what you saw in the movie applies directly to the group violence intervention work. So don't leave, don't go anywhere. This is not like you get a movie in 6th grade and you're like, okay, great. No, this documentary is actually very important and instrumental to the work, such that we felt that it was it dedicated and warranted you watching the whole thing in order to kind of get the key things that we wanted to share with you. So I am going to share my screen, and we will get the movie going in just a moment here. So please feel free to turn your volume up. If you want to grab some popcorn, grab some popcorn. It's only 32 minutes, so if you blink, you might miss it. All right, here we go.
Tonight, violence in Dorchester. Police say that a teenage boy was killed. And shooting spree has now left 3 people wounded.
Next, one of the most violent weekends in the city's history.
State Police Boston, recorded emergency 510.
My wife's been shot. I've been shot.
Where are you right now, sir? Can you indicate to me?
No, I don't know. He made us go to an abandoned area.
Okay, sir.
We heard it over the radio. We had a pregnant white female from the suburbs shot in the head, and we had her husband that was shot, and he was in critical condition at the time.
What's your name, sir?
Chuck Stewart.
Chuck.
Yeah.
Hang in with me, Chuck. Can you hear me? Chuck.
interested. My wife is sub-gurgling. She stopped breathing.
We responded to the scene. We were two of dozens of cops.
A brutal attack on a pregnant woman and her husband as they left.
There'd be at least 1 or 2 shootings a night back then. But that was a different type of shooting. We were mostly dealing with young black males who were involved in gangs and drugs. Here you have a woman in a prenatal visit at one of the premier hospitals in the city of Boston, carjacked and robbed and murdered.
See who did this? One guy, 2 guys, one. All right, what do you look like?
It really exploded that maybe Boston was an unsafe place.
A nightmare story of random crime and violent death.
Millions of television viewers across the United States listened in horror.
Every day you and your family and your friends are not victims of crime. The odds will increase, you will be. We feel vulnerable because we are vulnerable.
And the mayor came right out and said, I want everybody down here.
I instructed the police commissioner of the city of Boston and the police department to be as aggressive as they ever have been before.
Boston police are looking for one black male in connection.
One of the most intense police manhunts in the city's history.
Searching anyone who looks like a gang member or drug dealer, largely in the black neighborhoods.
The investigative efforts were concentrated in the Mission Hill housing development. Stops, arrests, and summonses for everything from drinking in public to small amounts of narcotics, because the concept was shake as many trees as you can until we start getting information on who committed this heinous crime.
The city was amazingly violent.
Since September 1st, 14 murders in Boston.
The neighborhood was essentially held hostage by the drug dealers. I and a few other individuals, every day, we would tour the neighborhood. I was on the streets the night that Carol Stewart died. Up and down the streets, you saw the blue lights. They were grabbing up young black males.
When I first came to Boston to be a pastor, I had family members and friends warn me, be very careful. Stay in the communities of color because it's a very racist city.
A massive police presence searched for the black male Charles Stewart
I
said had committed the
remember
crime.
driving in maybe 2 days after the woman was shot and killed and seeing police officers lining up these guys from Mission Hill. They would pull the pants down, they would be very obtrusive in their searches. It really made me feel very fearful about who I was as a black man.
There are reports of a possible break in the case. 39-year-old William Willie Bennett is considered a prime suspect.
He was an individual that had been involved with law enforcement many times, violent crimes, armed robberies, things like that. The initial information was that his nephew was kind of spouting off in front of a couple of other teenage males saying, yeah, it was my Uncle Willie that killed those 2 white people.
It's just a mad dog running amok, and society has to be protected here.
There was all this media about how dangerous the inner city is. It was almost tied into the character of black people.
The number of police officers that were assigned to the investigation was something that you would never see in the mission projects. There was a lot of feedback from the community that, well, wait a minute, we've got a lot of African-American kids being shot around the city. How come we never got this kind of response before? And they were right.
You had this confluence where you had all of this violent activity happening within the inner city, and you had the racial issues that we had to deal with on top of that.
Last October,
And the Charles Stewart case sort of put that on grand illustration.
There is an unsettling mystery tonight surrounding Boston businessman Charles Stewart.
I received a phone call from someone that Charles Stewart just jumped off the bridge, and that he's dead. And I was like, you're kidding me.
Yesterday afternoon, there was a dramatic turn of events which focused on Mr. Charles Stewart as a suspect.
There had been, we were now told, no black gunman after all, no robbery.
A racially charged murder that had police frisking young blacks at random and legislators crying for the death penalty was instantly transformed into an ugly domestic killing.
It made unavoidably obvious what people had been saying all along, which was when there's even a suggestion that a black man may be involved, the rules change.
Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan have been hit by a series of shootings, stabbings, and beatings. Much of the
Two teenagers were gunned down near a Roxbury playground.
Violence started to careen out of control in the late 80s. There was just shooting happening all over the place. And we were doing, as clergy, more funerals of teenagers.
Boston has seen a horrific increase in the number of violent crimes committed by and against its young black men.
And increasingly, these crimes are being committed by children, teenage gangs.
And you can go to any emergency room and you would see on gurneys young black men, usually Latino men, dying.
When we moved into Four Corners, we had no idea that young men had held the neighborhood hostage. The majority of adults were terrified by the neighborhood.
The city of Boston and the police department was denying that we had a gang problem. The intelligence unit at that time was concentrating more on the traditional mafia or Irish gangs, and nobody was really keeping track of these street gangs.
This kid's saying you shot him, Lawan. So if you didn't shoot him, you better have something to say to me.
These are kids between the ages of 16 and 24 that played basketball together, went to middle school together, and all of a sudden we're shooting back and forth.
You know, we seem to be locking up the same individuals over and over again.
We were making numerous arrests for drugs and guns. The judge would set conditions of probation, such as curfews.
How come you out this time of night? Huh? Oh, no, chilling.
But that was kind of the end of it for us, because it wasn't our job to check on those conditions of probation. It was the probation officers.
I kind of get the feeling from you that it's my fault that you're here, and that's not true.
The kids would come into the office, and they'd be talking about things that they had done at night. All we had to do was ask questions. Are you doing okay? Yeah. We only worked 8:30 to 4:30. That's all we had to do. 4:30, get in your car and go home.
You had some of our more violent offenders that nobody was checking.
We just gonna keep on doing it, and 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 doing it. Ain't no stopping us.
The gangs use street names: Humboldt, Intervale, Castlegate.
I grew up on Castlegate. It started off as just a bunch of friends. They would call us doughboys, because that's what we wanted to do, get money, look cute for the girls, and we started selling weed, and we got involved with these guys from New York, and they showed us that we could corner the market with this new drug called crack.
This was one of the main areas we hung in.
And you ever been to Stop and Shop right before a snowstorm, and it's a long line? That's how it was for crack. They came and they came. Now you can imagine, I'm still young. That was the most money I've ever seen in my life. We got involved with somebody from New York who got us guns. We had protection in our little world. We was on top of it.
Romero Holiday was public enemy #1 at one time up on Castlegate Road. Sold drugs, very violent. There was ongoing feuds at the time between the Castlegate crew and the crew up at Humboldt Ave.
Every day we went up there and we shot at them. Every day. We would literally, did you go up there today? No, come on, let's go up there. Every day. What did we call it? Putting them on the schedule. And we used to say, you want to put them on the schedule too? If you mess with me, if you deal with me, if you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you and anybody else that deals with you.
We were having broad daylight shootings. There was a number of innocent people caught in crossfires. Darlene Tiffany Moore was a young girl that was sitting on the mailbox at the corner of Humboldt and Homestead and caught a stray round, hitting her in the head and killing her.
Her mother had sent her down south to avoid the violence that was happening in the community. And she had come up to visit her mother. And this one visit, she was killed.
We were there on scene first and, watching the life flow out of a 12-year-old little girl. You're thinking, this is a child that lives in the same city that my son lives in. And, it's just unacceptable.
What is going on in this city, and particularly in District B,
is open warfare.
We pay our taxes, we do our work, we send our kids to school. Now we're demanding equal protection under the law.
We thought, like everybody else, that this was a generation that was going to be lost to jail and violence.
An 11-year-old boy is...
And that they were hopeless, and that the only method that we needed to deal with them was through enforcement.
Police have begun to stop and search suspected gang members for weapons.
Everybody put your hands on the wall. Everybody get your hands on the wall. I know where you live.
We were taking weapons off the street and getting cases on people that were selling drugs.
I made it my business during that time often. If I was driving home and I saw the police questioning somebody, I'd get out.
We don't play. Spread your legs.
It was very loud, very aggressive in many cases.
Disturbing allegations of cops arbitrarily pulling down people's pants.
There were people within the community who supported it. The problem is all kinds of innocent kids who had nothing to do with it got swept up in it as well. We're all just either perpetrators or potential perps to you. That's all we are.
I need to talk to you. A growing number of young people would come to me asking for assistance because I was doing outreach.
I'll get with you to talk about the other...
And so I started visiting the court 5 days a week, advocating for kids.
I remember walking by the courthouse, and he'd look at us, and we'd look at him, and we'd him back. It was us against them.
I had received reports that police had circulated the rumor that I was actually a drug dealer. This black clergyman was selling drugs in the black community.
The police department was dealing with racial issues.
The prime suspect in his...
That culminated when Charles Stewart killed his wife and blamed it on a black man.
It felt like the final straw. We've got a toxic racial dynamic happening right here. And there's no denying it. There's no getting around it.
You have dealt us an injustice.
Anger is too mild a word for what these black community leaders expressed today.
This time, however, the night riding was not the action of white-robed bigots, but instead the actions of a mayor, Mayor Raymond Flynn, who so quickly jumped to conclusions.
It was so blatant, it was played out in real time, and the whole nation was watching.
The most disturbing findings are those of public strip searches. There is no excuse for forcing young men to lower their trousers or for a police officer to search inside their underwear on public streets and hallways.
By 1990, the shootings and murders had increased. The stop and frisk resulted in more seizures of firearms, resulted in more arrests, more incarcerations. Didn't change the violence one bit, and the relationships with the African-American community and the police was deteriorating quickly. We were kind of like shoveling sand against the tide, and it was like, nothing's getting better, it's getting worse.
Kids are dying all hours of the day. Kids that were on probation. I had 65 kids shot to death in 5 years. Shot to death. And they were all one color. And nobody cared. A young man that I had on probation was shot to death. And his mom said, "Why did you let them kill my baby?" And she started to vent. And she started to hit me. I let her. And afterwards I thought, you know, she was right. She was right.
I thought I needed to understand the culture that all this violence is coming out of. And it became clear to me that no matter how many programs I would build for youth to come into the church, they weren't coming in.
I was working with some other ministers who also felt a real concern about what was happening with young people. The event, I think, that really crystallized it for a lot of us was the Morning Star incident. A funeral at a church very much involved in the community was crashed when some of the guys lost it when they saw somebody from a rival gang.
And a massive fight and turmoil breaks loose in the church, turning the complete service out and terrorizing everyone in the church.
The boy was stabbed 9 times before a shocked congregation.
The message I thought that Morning Star gave was We had to come out of the four walls of our sanctuary and meet the youth where they were.
Every Friday night, we were in the street, in the most violent neighborhoods. To see clergy doing patrols was a big deal. You had never seen black clergy patrols in the city of Boston.
But what we found out as we were walking the streets, that the youth weren't the only people watching us.
We would pass Reverend Ray Hammond, Reverend Eugene Rivers, Reverend Jeff Brown, and at nighttime, the black clergy and the police were the only adult males that were really out there in the community.
So we started to have meetings with them, you know, not about the state of policing or anything like that, but it was about the neighborhoods.
Jeff Brown became a fixture in our building. Gene Rivers was a fixture in our building.
We said, hey, we gotta try something different. These kids all wanted to please their probation officers because violation of probation meant they could be incarcerated. Probation officers didn't work nights, and the police officers didn't have the jurisdiction to knock on doors checking conditions of probation. And we said, look, we want to have the probation officers start riding with us at night.
While police have constitutional restraints on conducting searches, probation officers do not.
Is Antoine home? Do you have anything I don't want to find? Do you have a stash in here or anything?
If they weren't home or if they were in places where they weren't supposed to be, we were going to get them violated so we could get them off the street.
How are you? What are you doing?
Has a box cutter.
You came just to walk your girlfriend home?
No, that's not.
The longer we were out there, the more I learned about the nature of
That's where your heart's beating right now, right?
When you went into the houses, you know, you learned that they might be all that out on the street, but at home, they were the ones putting food on the table, making sure the youngins get up for school. So we started to get a bigger picture of that this wasn't a group of lost souls.
It was always separate. Now, all of a sudden, we're joined. And what we were doing, we were exchanging names, information, and intelligence. And then we were working with David Kennedy from Harvard.
I decided to try to do something practical, to try to figure out what was going on with the killing in Boston and what, if anything, might be done about it. There was this quite amazing coalition that had come together. It was Boston cops, prosecutors, probation officers, and outreach workers. We put a city map of Boston on a table and said, start somewhere and show us where these crews are and how they're operating. And we confirmed what they already knew.
There was kids who were perpetrators one day, victims the next, and all heavily involved in the criminal justice system. So really, at the end of the day, it was a small group that were driving the majority of violence. And if the police department didn't know them, probation knew them. Among all of us, we knew every one of them.
Every crew has one or two people who really drive things.
This is humble, buddy.
It was maybe 300 people. The political and media discourse had been about these massive issues. The crack epidemic, cultures of violence. And what this said was, say, look, this is 300 people whose names we know. And suddenly it began to seem like you could maybe do something. The Youth Violence Strike Force had done this operation on a group in Dorchester.
We wanted those guns taken off the street, and we just said, look, we're going to be down here until the violence stops.
We're going to make your life miserable. We're going to use every legal lever possible to shut you down. And the most important thing is that you are always following it up with, it's not about the open bear that I'm arresting you. It's about the violence.
They said to them, you want this to stop, put your guns down. And members of this crew actually delivered brown paper bags of guns to the steps of the gang unit. We took that and we built it into a violence prevention strategy.
What do? Let's bring them in the courthouse. What are we going to do? We'll talk to them. We're tired of seeing kids buried. We're tired of the violence.
You see me.
A number of speakers would get up and talk. We are here to tell you that if the violence doesn't stop, we will be bringing the full authority of the government down on you. But We also were delivering a message that if the violence stops, there are other options for you. And we will help you to get back into school, to get you some job mentoring, to get you out of this lifestyle.
We know who you are, we know what's going on. Do you want to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison? Your choice, your decision. Make a smart one. We'll help you, but you got to meet us halfway.
This isn't about locking kids up. This is about you growing up. This is about you giving the opportunity to be the best you can be. From the youth violence strike.
There were a small number of people that needed to be taken off the street for everybody's good.
Does everyone have a copy of
Issues of crime are too big for the police alone. I looked at the clergy as a measurement of are we doing things in the right way from a different perspective.
It wasn't a popular thing because people would feel you're a minister and you should believe that every child should be saved. And I would say in response, I believe that with all my heart, every child should be saved. It's just that for some kids, they need a prison ministry.
And we're all standing here together.
Clergy was same message we delivered, except they would add the caveat, we love you.
We'll help you if you let us, and we'll stop you if you make us. Go out there and tell your friends. And they stopped.
How you doing, man? How you doing, Pastor Hammond? How's everything?
Pastor Hammond would say, you guys y'all ain't that bad. Y'all just make bad decisions. And he made us understand that it was nothing wrong with being wrong, it's staying wrong.
We're serious about this.
Then he was like, you can come to my church, you can visit me, you can call me anytime you want, giving out his number.
Yeah, we're still working.
Whenever he came around, he would ask about me, and that meant a lot.
We got Romero working with MDC, and when we were all playing hockey with the police team, Romero was the kid driving the Zamboni. And we'd have our hockey bags, carrying them over to the bench with guns in them, and, you know, Romero would be like, oh, just leave them there, I'll watch them for you.
I think it took a lot just to trust that much of me. Them knowing how I was showed me that they seen something in me that I didn't see. So maybe I'm not the monster that everybody thought I was. One of my low points was this Tiffany Moore situation. It was my call that made us go up there every single day and shoot at these people. I didn't directly go up there and do it. You get what I'm saying? If I knew the right decisions and the right calls to make, none of this would have ever happened.
People are calling it the Boston Miracle. A city once torn apart by racial tension and violence is now a model of crime prevention.
Boston. We became the national poster children for successful programs.
Zero tolerance policy.
ABC came, CBS came, NBC came.
Streetwalkers program.
Youth gun crime is an epidemic.
Media, when they like to tell stories, they like to do it through the lens of like one person or one life.
To check juveniles on probation.
They would say it was probation visiting people at home. It was federal prosecution for gun crimes. The black ministers talking directly with guys on the street. The big picture was lost. It was putting them on notice that the violence was going to bring comprehensive legal attention. It was moving in social services, and it was moving in what we call the community moral voice.
What really made Boston special was really everybody being very willing to work with one another.
Boston proves that we can take the streets back of our country.
But when Bill Clinton came to Boston, when Newsweek came a-calling, things started to sort of shake the coalition. I was in the grocery store, and I looked at the checkout, and I see Gene Rivers' face, you know, at every single checkout counter. And I remember going into Dorchester to see Eugene. And Eugene was wearing sunglasses, like inside. And he was referring to himself in the third person. And, you know, it just changed everything.
Reverend Eugene Rivers is on the front lines of...
One of the unavoidable aspects of all movements is that somebody's going to end up being the signature person.
Their approach...
That's a fairly standard thing, right?
As the mythology about the Boston Miracle grew, there was this vicious fight for credit. Everybody stood up and said, I'm responsible for this.
There started to be resentments amongst the clergy, the police, probation, within each individual group. It wasn't about the violence, it was about marketing, if you will, and some people made their careers off of it. From the clergy to the academia to the police.
We sort of lost sight, lost our way. It stopped being a movement.
Now, lady, the daughter of a church plant.
All of us underestimate the difficulty of maintaining collaborations and partnerships just in general, with or without media attention, with or without dollars involved. 150 homicides will focus you. Harder to keep focus when it's down to 30.
This is the fourth shooting in Kalamazoo this weekend.
9 people have been shot here in the city in the last 5 days. Again, 3 homicides this summer.
2014 was when we had our highest number of shootings. Community relationships between law enforcement and people in neighborhoods aren't really good. So we wouldn't get cooperation. We would get no information on the shooter. And we had a 13-year-old kid that was shot and killed.
It was the second time the 13-year-old was shot in 6 weeks. He got hit in the back by gunfire on April 6th, but nobody was arrested.
Traditional policing methods did not prevent it, and so he said, what can we do to do something different? We have several shootings to discuss. And that's really the community came to us and said, hey, are there other things? And someone heard about the David Kennedy model.
I run the National Network for Safe Communities, and one of our convictions is communities need policing. They just don't need the kind of policing they've been getting. People deserve not to be afraid of the state. In the most dangerous places, hardly anybody's dangerous. And there are ways to engage them that can be very effective.
We looked at the guys who are actually pulling the trigger, and we came up with 22 individuals out of the entire city. We talk to those individuals, we know who you are, but in turn, we also provide them with phone numbers and names of people that can help them.
I bring understanding to the room because I sold a lot of drugs, did a lot of violence, and I'm telling them, the cops know who you are, man, and they want you to make a decision. I'm here to offer you a way out, and sometimes you need a person like me to explain that.
A lot of times people have never had a positive contact with a police officer. They've never had somebody show up at their door and say, I really want to see you get a job. I really want to see you be successful.
Here we are 6 months after. None of them have been arrested for an act of violence. That was shocking.
Good this morning. Yes, sir.
When I started, I was the poster child for traditional policing. You know, you need to stop cars and you need to get guns off the street and you need to get drugs off the street and drug dealers off the corners. That's what we did.
Hi, nice to meet you.
The hardest thing with any law enforcement is just changing a culture of an organization. If you just do traditional policing, you start to get jaded and think that everybody in this neighborhood is a bad person. Everybody in this neighborhood is a criminal, because that's all you're dealing with.
So you're good at geometry?
I never thought that I would be where I am now, where we spend more time building those relationships and working with the community. It changes the way you look at your neighborhood. You start to realize that, 99% of the people in this neighborhood are good folks.
I know the deaths has gone down.
Lots and lots of cities are doing it now, but there is no national strategy to address what we now know is addressable.
Have a great day, man. All right.
It's not perfect. It's actually relatively easy to put something like this together. It's very difficult to keep it going. We know things that make a really big difference.
I was looking for Sierra. She's not here? All right, we'll tell her Officer Nick said hi. All right, have a good night.
And it was Boston that created that understanding.
We built relationships. There was a level of trust that was earned over time.
My boss, I figured out, was the neighborhood. I worked with the chief, I worked with the commissioner, but I worked for everybody I didn't know. That was the flip for me.
The miracle was not that the crime rate went down. The miracle was that the adults figured out how to collaborate in the interest of the young people. That was the miracle.
Oh, all right. So we thought that showing you that video, that documentary, would give you a better understanding of what we're about to talk about in terms of GVI, its components, and how it works. You know, oftentimes we jump right into what GVI is, and focus deterrence, and what the facts say, and all this stuff is great, but we think it's really important for you to understand the context under which the original folk deterrence and what later became GVI came to be. You might have noticed in that video a real quick clip of a very a young man named David Kennedy at one point on the news, who is of course the executive director of National Network for Safe Communities. So having gone through that documentary, we just want to take a few moments and get any initial reactions or thoughts. Well, first of all, let me just do this just to make sure that everyone's ready and warmed up. If you were already familiar with what was called the Boston Miracle, let me get a Zoom emoji reaction. You can just at the bottom of your screen, there's a little face or a little plus sign says reactions. Right, you can give me a thumbs up. Okay, I see Mike. I'll see Mike and Wayne and Sarah and Nicholas and Randy and Wayne and all right, cool. So some of y'all are familiar, but it looks like a lot of folks maybe weren't already familiar with what was called the original Boston Miracle. So we got a mix. We got a mix of some folks in the room. If you are representing a law enforcement organization, whether that's police, probation, parole, whatever it may be in your state, prosecutors, whether it's a state's attorney or district attorney or U.S. attorney, let me get a Zoom emoji, whatever you want to put. You can put a clap or a thumbs up. Okay, I see Mike, Emily. Okay, we've got a few law enforcement folks in the room. If you are representing what some might call a social service agency or human services or social work, street outreach, anything along those lines, let me get a quick emoji. All right, Isaac Hunt as well. We got Rodney, Nick. All right. And anybody else who may be in any other category of community leader, academic, or elected officials office, government in general. Let me just get a quick Zoom emoji to see who's okay.
And that would include OBPs, right, Talib?
Yeah, we're gonna include OBPs, Officers of Violence Prevention. That's right. So, all right, we're gonna make sure that people are awake. All right. So now, and some of you have been able to see the emojis pop up. So now we all kind of get a sense of who's in the room. Any initial thoughts or reflections, anything that jumped out or stood out to you from watching that documentary? And you can, and just to get it organized, I see Isaac knows, Isaac and I've been on Zoom before. Do the little hand raise emoji. If you look in the bottom and just where you had that little Zoom emoji, where you had the little hand clap or the thumbs up, there's a little raise hand feature. So if you can just do the raise hand feature, that'll make sure that we don't have 40 people trying to jump in and talk over each other. So we'll start with Isaac, and then we'll move on to Sam. So Isaac, your initial reactions, just first of all, let me know if you've seen that before and what it brought out for you. It's faint. It's faint.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, I haven't seen the video before. For everybody to know, I've been doing this work now with the strategy for over 10 years. One of the key things that stood out to me about the video was towards the end where they were talking about once you bring the violence down, how do you maintain the energy and the movement of the strategy. And I think that's what we're facing here in South Bend, trying to keep the movement and the energy together with the strategy. So that was one of the main things that stood out to me.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's go with Sam up in Rochester.
Yeah, I can see where there would be a concern that on their initial response, they lacked procedural justice.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for adding that. Thanks for adding that. I saw a Q. I think there was there a hand raised from someone named Q? Okay, maybe not. All right, we'll come back to you, Q. And then W Minor threw in the chat. Once the law enforcement officers engaged the pastors and the members that live in the community, the crime started to improve. All right, thanks for that. Randy over in Madison, let's go to you.
Yeah, so I had not seen the video before, but I had heard about Boston in some of my research. So I'm part of our Office of Violence Prevention here at Public Health in Madison, Wisconsin. And the thing that stood out to me was, the size of Madison. One of the things that we are looking at, and they talk about in the video, is knowing the folks that are driving the problem, right, or that are driving the issues. And having that same conversation here where we're like, we know the folks, we know who's driving this stuff, and being able to work with those folks to mitigate that violence and to potentially stop the cycle. So it was really sort of encouraging to hear that same mindset.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing that, Randy, bringing that to the table. Any other particular thoughts or reactions to the documentary, or does any of the conditions or circumstances in the documentary reflect any of your experiences? Okay, we're gonna go to Jay Gomez. So I probably butchered that. My apologies, but yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Don't worry, Jose Gomez. The reaction I got from that video is very insightful. However, I asked myself the question, and maybe perhaps somebody in the panel has some insight. How do you go about engaging the clergy in the city when we face today, even the clergy has a tense relationship with the police? I find myself having that difficulty trying to engage clergy in my city because it makes sense. They're the stakeholder, the guardian of those particular community and those particular area. Is there any insight that anybody may have how to bridge that gap, since we find ourselves that nowadays, even between clergy and the police, some tension exists?
Gotcha. If we could we hold that question, because we're going to get into a broader discussion. So let's hold that. Let's actually keep it moving for time. So thank you for keeping us moving forward. And we're going to come back to that question. I think it's really important. And you'll hear from folks who have actually done implementations, like my colleague Sasha Cotton, with Europe from Isaac as well, and my colleague Megan, who's advised on it, and has been part of it as well. But there are a few themes that I just want to just kind of kick off and point out to that we want to make sure that folks come away with. One is that the original folks to Turn to Work was a break from the status quo. It was something that was different. All the different parties, right, came together and said, we have to do something different. That's what Officer Robert Murner said. We got to try something different. The only method that we thought to deal with them was through law enforcement, the stop and frisk that resulted in seizures of firearms, and more arrests, but it didn't change the violence, and the relationship between the African-American community and law enforcement was deteriorating. Partnerships, the strength of partnerships, which is what the question is going to, right? What Pastor Jeff Brown said is that what made Boston special was that everybody was willing to work with one another. And Pastor Ray Hammond said, the Boston miracle wasn't the reduction of violence. The Boston miracle was that the adults figured out how to collaborate in the interests of the young people. And then David Kennedy himself said that it's relatively easy to put something like this together. It's very difficult to keep it going. Direct communication, right? When probation officer William Stewart said, this isn't about locking kids up. This is about you growing up, talking directly to people who are at the highest risk of violence the very small number of people, right? In Kalamazoo, they were like, it's 22 people. That everybody knows who the very small number of people are. And also the humanity of everyone involved, including the people who are causing harm. So Romero Holiday, you know, said that it was just started off as a group of friends, yet he realized that he, you know, took responsibility for the death of what was going on in the community, but then said, maybe I'm not the monster everybody thought I was. Once he had a certain level of love poured into him and attention. Perceptions of the community, right? We're all just perpetrators or perps to you. That's all we are. That was a huge theme. And the disparate response that what Charles Stewart got when he said his wife had been killed versus the regular violence that folks had been seeing. So those are some of the themes that we wanted to leave with you, and how that directly ties into the work of GVI in the model is identifying the smallest number of people, right? The impact players who are driving the most of violence, having those open and direct lines of communication. Typically that's done through a call-in or a custom, which we can get into, and it'll be developed more in these further workshop series, establishing what those clear standards are, right? And what you saw in the video, they told folks very plainly and with transparency, what was going to, you know, if you do X, Y is going to happen, right? And it was with certainty. It wasn't just a threat. It was like, let me inform you about what's going on and changing those norms and those standards. Also offering meaningful support. Again, going back to Romero Holiday, who was supposed to be this monster, said that, hey, Pastor Hammond came and checked up on me every day and made sure to have what I needed. Even when Officer Murner said, when we started getting out in the streets and talking to these kids, we realized that some of them were the ones putting food on the table, right? How can their needs get met, right? And reserving strategic consequences for a last resort for if and when violence happens. And that's when you see Pastor Jeff Brown even say, listen, he believes as a pastor that everyone deserves ministry. In his words, some people need a prison ministry, and or some people might need a timeout in the most extreme of cases. So let me pass it over. I want to bring in my colleague Sasha Cotton, who was the former head of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention, and who has done GVI for a number of years, to talk about her experience. And my colleague Megan McDonald may jump in as well. But let me pass it over to y'all to talk about what this looks like, not just from a documentary and from general principles, but what does it look like on the ground?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. As Dr. Hudson said, I'm Sasha Cotton, the Senior Director of Strategy for NNSC, but up until recently, I was the Director of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention. And there we were implementing and continue to implement the group violence intervention as really one of the first violence prevention strategies being lifted up to really think about outside of the box strategies and pieces that could bring community together. So I'll start by saying we started that work in partnership with NNSC back in 2016 and rolled out the strategy in 2017. So we used 2016 as sort of a measuring year. And in that year, over the course of the summer, we had 91 group member involved shootings. So those were incidents that we could trace back, looking at data that either the victim or the perpetrator or both parties had group affiliations. In the next summer of 2017, with implementation of the group violence intervention, that number went down to 45 individuals and so individual shootings. And so I just always want to make the case for why this work works and how important it is when you're getting the strategy right. So for us in Minneapolis, at its best, the group violence intervention was really about having a three-legged stool approach that included law enforcement, social services, and a community moral voice work group. And really for myself as the project manager, I really acted as the seat of that stool. So if each of the legs are represented by those three pieces that I discussed before, the project manager is acting as the stool and really helping to distribute power, distribute resources, and distribute information. So you're preserving the integrity of law enforcement, of your community partners, and of your social service providers, and ensuring that they're getting the information that they need to do their work well, but they're not sort of feeling like they're standing outside of their lane. It's very important in the strategy that people feel like they're able to maintain the work that they do And so much of the relationship building that gets done between both social service agencies and community members is done based on their reputation with guys and women. We're seeing a growing number of women involved in groups, but particularly that respect, that credibility, and sometimes too deep of an appearance of affiliation with law enforcement can create a challenge on that. And so I don't think that was highlighted as much in the film, and certainly in a place like Minneapolis, with the tensions that have existed with our law enforcement community and our neighborhoods, our community members, that is an ongoing challenge and continues to be a challenge, certainly after the murder of George Floyd. But I wanted to talk a little bit about each of the three strategies as they were done at their best in Minneapolis. And, you know, I think to the points that were made in the film, as well as to some of the points that Isaac made, the sustainability is so hard. So I think it's important to always think about the renditions of how GVI will manifest in your communities, that it won't always be perfect, but sticking with it is such an important factor. So first, our law enforcement, we did make the move to develop a gang interdiction unit. So we had a unit within the police department that was specifically focused on delivering custom notifications, engaging with those who are most high risk, but also doing the enforcement actions when that was necessary. So that accountability piece that goes with GVI, which I'm sure we'll do more conversations about as we roll this series out. But really, enforcement actions are designed to look at when people violate community norms, when harm is caused, holding group members legally accountable. Dr. Hudson, were you going to chime in? Somehow you got centered on my screen, so I was just making sure you didn't have context. So the law enforcement piece is really driving both the engagement around providing notice around legal exposure in Minneapolis, but then also the enforcement actions on the back end. And what we found in Minneapolis is when we had that gang unit, which has since been dismantled simply because of numbers, that those officers were really able to demonstrate procedural justice in a different way from the regular police department or the mainstream officers. Part of that was because they really did know the players. They had information, they had relationships, but they also had an ability to refer them to resources, right? To say, I know you've talked to the social service agents. I know that they've offered you resources. When are you going to take those services? When are you going to, move your life in a different direction? How long do you think you can stand on these corners before something happens to you, before you're not safe, alive, and free, which is the message of GVI, is to keep people safe, alive, and free. So that really built some legitimacy. Plus, they were telling young men who were involved in groups on the front end what was likely to happen. So I think that piece is also so important, that it legitimizes people and officers in particular when they're telling young people and folks who are at high risk, hey, this is what you can expect. If you continue to do this, this is what's likely to happen. That makes a big difference. Thinking about the social service implementation, my brother Ferome is not on this call, but he is such a critical part of the social service network in Minneapolis because he's our lead case manager and has really brilliant relationships in community and is able to really legitimize why getting those services that put your life in a different direction is gangster, right? Like why that is credible and why that move to get your life away from violence, to be a provider and a protector of your community and of your family is the right thing for our young men to be doing. And I think that social service message coming from credible folks. So for those who don't know him, Ferome was definitely, in and on the streets back in the day in Minneapolis. The same officers who has ultimately built relationships with now in his role were some of the same officers that chased him and likely arrested him in his youth. And he, spent time incarcerated. And I'm not sharing his story for no reason. And I'm not sharing anything that he doesn't talk about all the time. But his experience with the penal system, his experience being in the street, his experience being a victim of gun violence gives him a sense of credibility. I know that David Carson is on the call, and he's also one of the case managers in Minneapolis, and another person who really just is relatable and able to connect to folks because he's from Minneapolis and has, just relationships on the ground, particularly in our American Indian community. And so having people who know the community, who have relationships in the community, who can do that case management, social service work is so important. And then the last piece of the stool really being community moral voice. And I think this is a part that can often get overlooked. In Minneapolis, at our best, we had a very robust community moral voice work group that met on a monthly basis. They met with law enforcement and were getting regular updates from law enforcement, both about the strategy and about what was happening generally on the ground. They also did events. So they hosted a holiday party every year for our guys. They did block parties, but they were core messengers of why this strategy was important and helped to legitimize, again, this strategy and why keeping our young people safe, alive, and free involves everybody, that everybody has a role to play, and that community has a very central role to play in setting community norms and community standards. So that's a little bit about the Minneapolis implementation. Of course, like everyone, post-pandemic, things have changed, and I know Minneapolis is working really hard to get the strategy back to where it was in its, at its prime. So again, just a reminder that even if the strategy isn't perfect, it's still helping people, it's still serving people, and it's important to keep plugging and working to get those collaborations and those partners back fully engaged and at their height so that you can reach the most people with the greatest value. So I'll pause there to leave and turn it back over to you.
Thanks. Can you just, and you can take this or Megan, I just want to just come back to the question that was raised about building that relationship. You mentioned the project manager is the seat. What about when two of the legs are not exactly coming together? How does that work?
Yeah, it's challenging, but with the three-legged stool, I don't know how many of you have ever been on a short, have ever been on a stool where one leg is too short, right? I think it's really difficult if there's no third leg or no, but oftentimes you'll find that, one leg is a little short, right? Everybody's not able to carry their weight. And when that happens, that's when it becomes so important for the other legs of the stool to be able to take on more weight, right? So if law enforcement, I'll just be candid, in Minneapolis, our numbers are down exceptionally, right? The level of activity of our enforcement agents is not where it once was. So that makes it so much more important that we pivot and talk about, yes, we want you safe, alive, and free. And maybe that law enforcement's not going to be able to hold you as accountable as they could when they had their full numbers, but the guns on the streets are still very real. And your involvement with the group is driving violence that's going to get you killed, right? And so your messaging has to be able to shift. But if you're able to think about how safe, alive, and free are all super important, I think that the stool stands, right? That would be my message. But Megan, I would certainly love to hear anything you have to say.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Sasha. I think the other thing that I was thinking about and that we've seen in different cities across the country as they've, embarked on this work is that, and back to your question, Commissioner, is, it won't be everybody, right? So if there's tension between the clergy and the police in your city right now, getting the clergy uppercase T, uppercase C is likely not going to happen, nor does it have to in order to get the work done, right? There might be one or two partners like a Pastor Brown, like a Pastor Rivers to begin having those conversations. And I think it'll, and you've been doing this work, of course, as well. But it's clear who's at the table and who's at the table for the right reasons. And you can start there. So that's one of the most important things, I think, as you're thinking about, how to build that stool, how to get people to the table. We refer to it as, the coalition of the willing, right? Let's start with who wants to be at the table. Let's figure out how we can get started with what we have and sort of build from there, which is not unlike the reason that we wanted to start with this conversation as part of launching this workshop series, right? So there's a lot of specifics. Sasha, got into them. You could see what this looks like in practice a little bit by looking back at Boston and a little bit in Kalamazoo, and every city, the way that they actually do the work varies because of who's at the table, because of, the dynamics in that particular community. But being able to have that stool in place, knowing that sometimes, depending on politics, depending on capacity issues, depending on tensions and relationship issues, one piece of that could falter or could weaken. Being able to know that, to have a strong enough partnership to work through that and deal with that address it honestly. And like Sasha said, have somebody else kind of pick it up for a little bit, fill that gap is really, really important and crucial. And then once you have that, getting the actual work done is really the easy part. I'm conscious of time. I know we have a couple last words at the end. But before that, wanted to pause. I can pass it back to you, Talib, but to see if anyone has, if there's anything resonating, questions, thoughts, your experience from doing work in your cities you want to bring in.
Megan, I just wanted to jump in and add, because I think based on the film, we could be sending the message that the moral voice has to be faith-based or pastors. And in Minneapolis, that is not the case. We actually don't have any faith-based partners. They're certainly welcome. They're not excluded, but it really is folks who care about their community. It's moms from schools, it's aunties, it's lots of different people. So it doesn't have to be faith.
That's a great point, Sasha. And then just to add on to that, I used to work for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in the Community Partnerships Unit. So my job was to go out and build relationships with the community, and it can be a challenge when you're dealing with large institutions that have histories, that have baggage that exists way beyond when we were even born, right? And so it means building relationships take time. That's just the hard reality of any relationship, any friendship, any kind of coworkers, right? Like no one just comes off the bat and is just like cool with each other. I think what was key in the documentary, a couple of things. I mean, it was only 32 minutes, but one of the things you may have picked out is that it wasn't as though probation, police, and the pastors didn't know who each other were. They knew who each other were. They just didn't like each other, right? And it wasn't until like there was a certain need for them to all focus together, and a mechanism for them to do that. And then even with that, they talked in the video about how that relationship had to get built. You know what I mean? It wasn't all, the video starts in 89, 90. When people talk about the Boston Miracle, that's like in 96, 97, 98, right? This was not like, tomorrow everyone's relationship was great. But to your point, Megan, I do want to be respectful of time and see if other people have questions as well. And Commissioner, I hope you can come to the future workshops and keep bringing those questions, even if that, and to dig into this more, because this is something that needs to really be done. The question that you're raising is something that's not a one-time answer. It's something that kind of gets worked out in community, right, with other folks. And then Isaac says you have to meet the clergy one at a time. Okay, yep. Any other questions that people have about doing this work that we're talking about, this group violence intervention, focused deterrence work? Go ahead, Isaac. Go ahead.
How do we say to help you do that for the top you make? How do we maintain the word given?
It might just be me, Isaac. I'm sorry to interrupt. Your audio is a little low.
You sound underwater. Yeah.
I keep putting it on my Bluetooth. I'm sorry. Our message is we'll help you if you let us, we'll stop you if you make us. How do we maintain the credibility on the end of enforcement, but also the end of social services, and following through with individuals on a regular basis, but also being able to maintain metrics and case notes to be able to prove the work that we're doing?
That's a very important question, Isaac. As a matter of fact, that question is so important. I think it deserves getting a treatment over multiple sessions. And as a matter of fact, that's just what we're going to do. This GVI Workshop Series, it is a workshop series. Some of you who may be familiar with GVI know that we have a thing called GVI University, where we try to pack so much information into 1 or 2 days, 3 at best. And so what we're gonna do is dive deeper into these issues and workshop them over a period of time that Michael will talk about in a moment. And so we can come and bring these questions and we can workshop them together and really figure out ways in which some of the best way to do this work. Because even though we highlighted what happened in Boston. And in the same breath, we're also going to say that GVI in 2022 is not GVI in 1996, right? There have been a lot of iterations along the way. There's been a lot of things that we have learned. What we call support and outreach now is not what support and outreach once was even 5 or 10 years ago. I know Isaac can tell you about that because he was one of the people that changed it. I see a question here: were there any youth that got involved to help change the violence in their community? Let's bring that question back to this workshop series, because that's going to get into empowering people to be credible messengers, empowering people to be community moral voices. But also, just because someone may have been involved in the life doesn't mean you can just put them up front and say, okay, now you're a credible messenger, go, right? That's a whole thing in and of itself. So we're going to get into all of those details and nuances. And let me turn it over to my colleague, Michael Akimpora, who can give you the sneak preview of what you can expect to come in your future series.
Great, thank you, Talib. Just gonna share my screen quickly for just a couple more minutes. So like Talib was saying, the idea behind these workshops is that they are a series. They're going to build on each other, and we're going to be learning and kind of exploring as we go each of these different facets of GVI. So session 2 is called Focusing on the Right People. It's currently scheduled for Thursday, January 12th, at the same time as this session today. And that's going to be digging into the group member involved, or GMIs, we call them, concentrations. Those small number of high-risk individuals, most at risk of being shooters or being shot and getting exposed to violence, how to identify them, how to reach them, and the mechanisms to do so. So some of you might be familiar with them: problem analysis, a group audit, shooting review, just ways of finding those folks, reaching them, the deliverables attached to engaging with them, and that kind of foundation for the rest of the intervention. Then future sessions will be those deep dives Talib was just talking about on each discrete component of GVI: direct communication, support and outreach, community moral voices, police legitimacy, managing resources and partnerships, much of which we touched on today. The video touched on, Sasha and Megan touched on, but each session will be that deep dive into those fields and kind of our experts and our partner experts from around the country engaging with us on those. So to keep in touch or for more information, you can contact us at GVI Workshop at nnscommunities.org, or you can go to our website, nnscommunities.org, just click resources, and there's a GVI Workshop Series tab where we'll have materials from today's session, information about future sessions, upcoming sessions, and you could share all of that with your partners, your colleagues, anyone you know who might be interested in learning about this work, engaging with this work. You could forward them along. We'll invite them to the next session, the session after that, and we'll go from there. But thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited about the future of these sessions, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.